The envelope was already there at 9:06 a.m., cream-colored, sealed, centered on the polished table like a threat that didn't need words. I froze for a second. This was our weekly strategy meeting. Same room, same hour, same bitter coffee. But today, no one else showed up, just him. Asher Langston sat at the head of the table like he'd earned it. Crisp suit, smug half-smile, and that irritating habit of never making full eye contact. CEO's son-in-law, married 6 months, promoted 2 weeks, no prior record in systems, patents, or even tech. But here he was, handing me the end of 23 years in a single envelope. This isn't personal, Elena. We're just restructuring legacy roles. Legacy roles. I designed the system Stravara was built on, its architecture, its fail-safes, its digital bloodline. I'd written code from hospital waiting rooms, signed contracts between funeral calls. I was the first employee to arrive when we hit Series A, and the last to leave when funding fell through. And now I was a legacy, not even a conversation, not a thank you, not even the decency of the CEO showing up to do it himself. Just Asher, with a soft voice and cold execution. Acting like this was just a spreadsheet correction. He leaned back like it was over, but something shifted in me. I looked at him, not the ring, not the resume padded with buzzwords, but him. He didn't know the product. He didn't know the protocols. He didn't even know where the system backups lived, but he knew who he married. And in this building. That was apparently enough. I said nothing, just slipped the envelope into my bag. My hand trembled slightly, but I smiled. It wasn't a real smile. It was the kind you wear when someone mistakes your life's work for overhead. The kind that says, "You have no idea what you've just touched." As I walked out, I caught my reflection in the glass, straight back, pressed blouse, and 30,000 hours of brilliance being reduced to a cost-cutting line. But what they didn't know, what he didn't know, was that the system he'd just taken from me. It wasn't theirs to begin with. The hallway smelled like hand sanitizer and burnt coffee. Monitors beeped steadily in nearby rooms, the rhythm of machines standing guard over the fading. That was where I signed the first draft of the Ravek schematic, in the oncology wing. 3rd floor. Mercy Hill Medical Center. My mother was dying 3 doors down. It was 10 years ago, almost to the day. I hadn't slept in 36 hours. Her voice was faint, her skin translucent. But when I told her I was heading to the lab to finalize the blueprint, she'd clutched my hand and whispered, "Finish it here." So I did. I opened my laptop in the hallway, balanced it on my knees, and reviewed the final schematic. The architecture was raw, elegant, unstable, just like I was in that moment. The attorney emailed me the temporary filing form. I typed my full legal name at the time, Elena Hartwell, the name on my birth certificate, the name on my mother's records, and I clicked sign. I remember looking up after and seeing her watching me from the doorway, IV line trailing behind her like a silk thread. "There," she'd said, voice barely audible. "Now it's yours." She passed the next morning. I didn't tell anyone at the office, not the CEO, not legal. I went back to work the day after the funeral. I buried myself in deadlines, believing the sacrifices made me stronger. That loyalty was armor, that if I gave enough of myself, missed enough birthdays, turned down enough job offers, sat silently through enough meetings where younger men got credit for my lines of code, I'd be undeniable. But I was wrong. Because 2 days ago, I was labeled non-essential. Because yesterday, they archived my staff login. Because this morning, I was handed a beige envelope by a man who thinks blockchain is a sci-fi concept. I spent 23 years at Stravara. I was there before we had a logo, before we had a website, back when the lab's insulation peeled off the walls and we used heat guns to keep the servers running through winter. And now? Now I'm a line item in a spreadsheet, a redundancy. They don't know where Ravex was signed, They don't know what it cost me. They only know what it's worth today. But value isn't always visible on paper. Sometimes it's buried in a hospital hallway, in a dying mother's last words, and in the name you never expected to need again. Elena Hartwell. The name on the patent. The one they forgot. There's a particular kind of man who enters a room like the air owes him space. Asher Langston was that man. He didn't earn his way into Stravara. He married into it, 6 months ago. He became the CEO's golden son-in-law, 2 weeks later. He was named Chief Strategy Officer, a title no one had ever heard of before, but one that gave him unrestricted access to meetings he didn't understand and decisions he wasn't qualified to make. He had the polished look of a man who paid someone else to prepare his pitch decks. Tailored suits, a Harvard MBA, a face built for PR. But beneath the polish was a hollowness I could hear every time he opened his mouth. I remember the first meeting he led. It was a Thursday morning, full tech staff present, whiteboards covered in diagrams, real-time dashboards running across the monitors. And then he asked, with complete sincerity, "Have we considered building an operating system that can feel emotions?" The room went dead silent. Someone coughed. One of the engineers blinked like he'd misheard. I stared at Asher, trying to locate the punchline. There wasn't one. We weren't developing AI therapy bots. We were building secure, scalable systems for critical infrastructure. The closest we came to emotions was error flagging, when something breaks. It yells. But Asher thought tech should feel, and apparently, his feelings were now the driving force behind company strategy. He'd never coded a line, never pushed a product to market, never stayed up past midnight fixing a rollback issue or negotiating server load with a global vendor. But he had the ring, and in this company. That was enough. I learned to watch him carefully, not because I respected him, but because I didn't trust what he'd break next. He didn't see legacy systems. He saw roadblocks. He didn't see experienced engineers. He saw overhead. And the worst part? He smiled through it all, like disruption was a virtue and loyalty a relic of the past. So when I sat across from him at 9:06 a.m., with that envelope between us, I didn't just feel insulted, I felt endangered. Because men like Asher don't just cut costs, they dismantle foundations without knowing what those foundations are holding up. And when it all collapses, they blame the architects. He thought I was the past, but I was the only thing still holding his present together. There's a quiet power in remembering who you were before they tried to rename you. Long before I became Elena Brooks, Senior Systems Lead. I was Elena Hartwell, the name my mother whispered when I won my first science fair. The name printed on my college thesis. The name on every early R&D sketch I ever scribbled in the margins of a lab notebook. I never let that name disappear. Not legally, not professionally. 10 years ago, just after the first Ravex prototype reached functional stability, my mentor, an IP attorney turned consultant, took me to lunch. She didn't talk about licensing or clauses. She talked about people, about power. "They'll thank you until you're inconvenient," she said. "Then they'll forget you were ever part of it. So if that day comes, make sure they don't need your name. Make sure they need your signature." That night, I filed the paperwork to open an LLC in a jurisdiction with rock-solid IP protection. I registered every design element, core framework, encryption structure, and biometric interface under one entity, Hartwell Dynamics. Owner, Elena Hartwell. I never told anyone at Stravara. Why would I? They never asked. They were too busy slapping logos on my code and attaching middle managers to my team like barnacles. I kept delivering. They kept assuming. When I got married 3 years later and changed my name on payroll, no one from legal requested an update on my prior filings. They assumed the company owned the work because I created it while employed. But none of them had read the original provisional application. None of them knew that the earliest codebase, version 0.9 alpha, was submitted before I signed my full-time offer, so I let them assume. And I kept building. There were moments I questioned whether the precaution was paranoid. After all, I was loyal. I believed in the company, in the mission, in the team. I stayed through 4 rounds of layoffs. I trained managers who eventually outranked me. I declined 2 CTO offers from rival firms. But that name, Hartwell, stayed in ink, not memory. And now, as I sit on my balcony, envelope still unopened beside me, I feel no panic. They cut me out of the system. But they never checked who owned the system. When they go looking for control, they'll find a gap in the chain. And in that gap sits my name, quiet, legal, immutable, not out of spite, out of foresight, out of control. It was a quiet Tuesday when the message came through. Just a polite email in my inbox, with a subject line that read, "Request for confidential conversation. Virelia Tech." I stared at it for 10 minutes without clicking. Virelia, Stravara's oldest rival, the company we competed against for every federal contract, every innovation grant, every headline. For years, we tracked their patents, dissected their language, and anticipated their moves like we were playing a long, silent game of chess. In public, we never acknowledged them. In private, we built entire contingency strategies around their weaknesses. And now they wanted to talk. To me, I finally opened the email. It was direct, professional, and astonishingly respectful. They had reason to believe that I, not Stravara, held the underlying rights to the Ravex core system. And if that was true, they were prepared to discuss a full exclusive licensing agreement with additional options for strategic advisory. No threats, no legal posturing, just one line near the bottom that read, "If you are, in fact, the rightful architect, we believe you should be the one deciding where your legacy goes next." My first reaction wasn't excitement. It was nausea. I closed the laptop and stood up, pacing the kitchen, the weight of the past 2 decades pressing in like humidity. Stravara had been my life. I'd spent more nights there than in my own home. I'd built it from inside the walls, when we had nothing but burnt coffee and a broken server rack. I'd brought Ravex to life on a whiteboard. When our CTO thought it was too risky and finance said the model was too theoretical, I'd fought for every inch of it, not for profit, but because I believed it could change how we protected infrastructure around the world. Now I was being offered a chance to hand it to our biggest competitor. It wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about identity. Who was I now? A disgraced employee? A silent architect? A traitor? Was protecting my work betrayal? Or was letting them ruin it the true betrayal? I sat back down and reopened the message. They weren't asking me to destroy Stravara. They were asking me to choose what Ravex becomes, and under whose leadership it evolves. And the truth I couldn't avoid was this. Stravara wasn't Stravara anymore. Not the place I helped build, not the team I bled for. Now it was led by people who didn't know the language of systems, who valued buzzwords over architecture, who fired their chief engineer over coffee without so much as checking where the foundation was laid. It wasn't the house I built anymore. It was someone else's facade, resting on blueprints they never read. I took a long breath, clicked reply, and began to type. 1 sentence. If we're going to talk, we talk in person. Because I wasn't just negotiating a contract. I was deciding what stayed, and what deserved to fall. The silence in my apartment that afternoon was a different kind of quiet. Not the stunned stillness of betrayal. Not the aching pause of grief. It was a calculated, spacious calm, like the space between 2 chess moves when one player realizes they've just walked into a trap. Except this time, I was the one holding the next piece. I sat at my desk, tea gone cold beside me, with 3 documents open on my screen. The original Ravex provisional patent filing, the core licensing framework for Hartwell Dynamics, and a scanned PDF of the intellectual property licensing agreement Stravara had signed back in 2015. It had been years since I looked at these files, not because I forgot, but because I never needed to prove anything until now. Most companies get lazy with contracts once the product takes off. They assume their control is absolute, especially if the person who built the system is still showing up to work on time and fixing things before anyone notices they're broken. Stravara was no different. They treated my ongoing support like passive loyalty, not realizing every bit of access I granted was a courtesy, not a default. I scrolled to page 14 of the agreement. Subsection C, Legal Considerations in Successor Licensing. And there it was, still intact, Clause 11.3, Non-transferability without original architect consent. No licensing rights, derivative works, integrations, sub-distributions, sublicensing agreements, or vendor transfer arrangements concerning the Ravex core system may be executed, renewed, or expanded without written approval and verified biometric authorization from the original system architect, as defined in Article 2.1a, herein listed as Elena Hartwell. I stared at it for a long time, not because I was surprised, but because I was impressed at just how cleanly it had held. It was a clause I drafted myself in 2015, long before the executive team understood the commercial potential of Ravex. At the time, they were thrilled I cared enough to handle the legal details. No one had redlined it. No one had flagged it. They'd been too busy chasing Series B funding. Now that clause was a loaded weapon. If they tried to resell, relicense, or expand deployment of Ravex without me, every contract would be invalidated on signature. It wasn't just a legal snag, it was a kill switch wrapped in legal language and buried beneath 2 decades of arrogance. And the best part? They had no idea it existed. They'd never bothered to revisit the agreement. They assumed ownership was about name recognition and salary bands, not binding structure. They thought firing me removed me from the system, but systems, real systems, don't work that way, not the ones built to last. I sat back and clicked Save on the updated review copy. My pulse was steady. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't mourning. I was ready. Because the only thing more dangerous than a woman who's been underestimated is one who remembers exactly what she wrote. The rain had stopped just before I stepped out of the car. The sidewalk still glistened, puddles catching soft reflections of the Vorelia Tech building. Sleek, modern, understated. Not showy like Stravara's headquarters, but purposeful, like it was built for people who knew the value of what happened inside. Not how it looked from the outside. 10 o'clock sharp, Monday morning. I walked through the sliding glass doors with nothing but a slim leather folder in hand. No entourage, no lawyer, no PR rep. Just me. The receptionist greeted me like they had been briefed down to my shoe size. I was escorted through 2 security checkpoints, up to the executive floor, and led into a conference room with walls made of glass and silence. No branding, no theatrics. Inside, a single folder sat on the table, and beside it, 2 men, Varelia's general counsel and their head of strategic development, rose to greet me, both with the same expression, focus without force. They didn't try to win me over, because they knew they didn't have to. I sat, opened the folder, and read. The licensing agreement was clean, precise, exclusive rights to Ravex Core. Fully attributed to Hartwell Dynamics. Total contract value, $920 million over 10 years. Non-negotiable clause. No derivative alterations to the original architecture without written approval from the Chief Technical Steward. Listed. In bold, Elna Hartwell, Senior IP Consultant. They had done their homework. I reached for the pen. My signature was smooth, deliberate. I didn't blink, I didn't speak. Because this wasn't a transaction. It was a correction. I wasn't selling myself. I wasn't selling revenge. I was giving my life's work the future it deserved, away from the incompetence and entitlement that had infected the house I once called home. There was no applause, no handshake photos, just two quiet nods, and a moment of stillness so vast it felt sacred. As I walked out, no part of me trembled. No part of me wished I had made them beg. I didn't need a courtroom. I didn't need a stage. I didn't need to scream that they were wrong, because Travara would figure it out soon enough. They'd launch a version of Ravex and watch it fail compatibility checks. They'd hit clause 11.3 and call legal in a panic. They'd scramble through filing cabinets and digital archives, hunting for a name they forgot even existed. But I hadn't forgotten. I never stopped being her. Elena Hartwell, the woman who finished signing in 10 seconds and walked away with everything that mattered. Quietly, completely, and entirely on her own terms. Sometimes liberation isn't loud. Sometimes it sounds like nothing at all. Just a pen gliding across paper, and the weight of 2 decades lifting off your chest like mist after rain. It started with a quiet change no one noticed, at least not at first. At 7:42 a.m. on Wednesday, the banner headline on Stravara's homepage disappeared. It had read, Ravex 3.0 Expansion, launching globally this quarter. By 7:43, it was gone. No announcement, no replacement. Just an empty space where the company's biggest brag had lived for weeks. I wasn't watching the site, but someone else was. By 8:13, a former colleague forwarded me a screenshot. No banner, no Ravex. The page now featured a recycled product quote from 3 years ago, generic and vague. Beneath it, a single line of code in the source read, temporarily removed for internal review. The panic had begun. By 9:06, an internal memo was leaked to a private industry Slack channel. Stravara's legal department had requested a full audit of every licensing agreement tied to Ravex Core. It had a red banner at the top. Urgent, executive-level review only. At 10:21, I received a text from a friend in finance. Just 5 words. You didn't tell them, did you? I didn't reply. By noon, the cracks widened. The CEO called an emergency executive meeting. Board members were contacted directly. And by 2:12 p.m., the biggest blow landed. Hanley and Lorne Capital, Stravara's second-largest institutional investor, issued a notice of immediate withdrawal. Not a warning, not a request, an extraction. Over $84 million pulled in under 2 hours. Quietly, coldly. It didn't make headlines yet, but inside their walls. I could feel the pressure drop like a sudden altitude shift. People scrambling. Compliance combing through old archives. Mid-level managers digging up emails from 5, 10, 15 years ago, trying to piece together when the ownership trail started slipping through their fingers. And then came the part that made me pause. That evening, as I folded laundry with the news muted in the background, I got another message. This time from someone I hadn't heard from in 8 years. Evelyn Shaw, once Stravara's VP of Strategic Growth. She'd famously told a conference crowd that I was brilliant but too old school to lead in this decade. Her message now? Is it true the patent was never ours? And that you still hold the core license? I sat down on the edge of the bed, reread it once, then again. No anger, no apology. Just a question asked in fear, from the mouth of someone who once labeled me obsolete. I didn't answer her either, because the answer was already playing out in real time. Ravex was untouchable. The platform was locked. Clause 11.3 was ironclad. And every investor with eyes and a calculator would soon realize the crown jewel of Stravara's future wasn't theirs to sell. They fired me thinking I was disposable. But they never bothered to ask who was holding the foundation. And now they were watching the walls crack. One timestamp, one clause, one signature at a time. The file arrived in my inbox just after 7:15 p.m., an audio message forwarded from a burner Gmail address I didn't recognize. No subject line, no greeting, just an attachment titled, Internal exec call recording 7:12. I almost deleted it. Then I saw the name in the metadata. Forwarded by J. Campbell, Jordan Campbell, a systems engineer I once mentored during his first year out of grad school. Quiet, loyal, brilliant. He'd once asked me how to push back when upper management tried to take credit for his work. I taught him how to keep receipts, so I clicked play. The recording was muffled at first, chairs scraping, someone adjusting their mic, distant feedback, but then Asher's voice cut through, loud and panicked. Wait! She used her maiden name? A beat of silence. I thought we registered that IP under Brooks. Who let that through? Who signed off? Another voice, lower, tighter, less frantic. The CEO. It wasn't our filing. It predates the employment contract. We only have secondary rights through the derivative license. Another pause. This one heavier. So, we don't own RaveX? Asher again, barely concealing the disbelief. Not the core system, not without her signature. There was a long exhale, like someone had just realized they were holding a bomb with no timer and no instructions. Then, Asher again. This time louder. Shriller. No one thought to check if she'd registered under her old name? Seriously? Who the hell approved legal without updating her documents? And then, finally, silence. The kind that doesn't come from technical failure, but from failure of understanding. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I simply stepped out onto my balcony, the sky still streaked with the last threads of daylight, and pressed my phone to my chest like it might warm the spot that used to ache. In my other hand, a cup of jasmine tea, cool now, but still fragrant. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't gloating. It was something colder, validation. They had erased me in boardrooms, edited me out of pitch decks, referred to my legacy in past tense while I was still walking their halls. And now, they were unraveling, not because I struck back, but because they never thought to read the fine print next to the name they stopped saying. Elena Brooks. That's who they fired. But Elena Hartwell? She's the one they never saw coming. That signature was never for them. It was for me. For the systems I built. For the woman who stayed too long, gave too much, and finally remembered what she was worth. So I sipped my tea, let the breeze touch my face, and smiled. Not with victory, with clarity. You can't fire what you never owned, and you can't bury a name that never needed your permission to live. The lights on the main stage dimmed as the keynote panel was announced. I stood just behind the curtain, heart steady, heels planted on polished floor. Listening to the applause roll across the auditorium, I'd spoken at conferences before. Back when I still wore the company badge with pride. Back when my work was introduced as part of a team effort. And my name, when it was mentioned at all, came second, third, or not at all. But this time was different. A soft chime signaled the panel intro slide, and then the moderator's voice echoed into the hall. Joining us now is the creator of one of the most resilient core systems in infrastructure AI today, newly licensed to Virelia Tech. Please welcome Elena Hartwell. The doors opened. I walked out, flanked by Virelia's lead engineers, two of them women I once trained, now rising into their own brilliance. At center stage, 4 seats waited, each with a nameplate. When I reached mine, I froze for just a breath. There it was, black ink on brushed steel. Elena Hartwell, creator of the RaveX core system. Not co-author, not advisor, not from the original team. Creator. I took my seat, spine straight, chin lifted. The moment didn't call for pride. It called for peace. The discussion was sharp, layered, forward-thinking. We spoke of autonomy in code, ethical safeguards, post-quantum security. I answered 2 questions with precision, one with warmth, and one about ownership and attribution, with a stillness that made the crowd lean forward. After the session, A line formed near the edge of the stage, mostly engineers, mostly younger than me, but one in particular stood out. A girl with oversized glasses and a press badge hanging crooked from her lanyard. When she reached me, she didn't offer a handshake. She just whispered, "They used to say you were just part of the team, but now I know. You were the system itself." I didn't respond with words. I just nodded. Because she was right. They had fired Elna Brooks. They had forgotten Elna Hartwell. But systems remember their foundation, and legacies, real ones, don't vanish when someone removes your name from a badge. They rise when you do. If this story moved you, even just a little, leave a comment. Tell us your story, your silence, your fight to be seen. Like if you've ever built something others tried to take credit for. Share it with someone who deserves to be reminded. Your name matters. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, because somewhere out there, someone else is rebuilding their name, and we'll be here to witness it.